For more than half a century, she was one of the most recognized women on Earth and one of the most carefully hidden. The world knew Jacqueline Kennedy by her image, the pillbox hats, the whispered voice, the composure she held together on the worst day of her life, when she stood in a blood-stained suit and refused to change because she wanted the world to see what had been done. That was the public Jackie, polished, mysterious, almost untouchable. But there was another Jacqueline, a private woman who poured her real thoughts onto paper and sent them quietly across the ocean to a man almost nobody knew about. For decades, those pages sat locked in a safe in Dublin. And then, in the spring of 2014, they came to light. What did they reveal about the woman behind the legend? Stay with us as we open Jacqueline Kennedy's long-lost letters and the private heart they finally exposed. The story did not begin with headlines. It began in a quiet college in Dublin, inside a safe, where a bundle of handwritten letters had rested for years. They were addressed to an Irish priest named Father Joseph Leonard, and almost no one outside that religious community knew they existed. Then, in May 2014, the world found out. A series of letters written by Jacqueline Kennedy to Father Joseph Leonard across the 1950s and 1960s was set to be sold at Shepherd's Irish auction house. The auctioneer, Philip Shepherd, did not describe them as a few personal notes. He called the collection, in effect, the unpublished autobiography of Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, covering the entire period of her marriage to John F. Kennedy, her years as First Lady, and her grief after his assassination in 1963. That phrase is worth holding on to, an autobiography that Jackie never meant to publish, because unlike a memoir written for the public, these letters were never shaped for an audience. They were written to a trusted friend in private, with no thought that strangers would ever read them, and that is exactly what made them so powerful. There were more than 30 of them, and they offered a rare glimpse into the personal dreams, wishes, and fears of a young woman who would go on to become one of the most famous figures in the world. To understand why she wrote so openly to this particular man, you have to go back to the very beginning of their friendship, which itself reads like something out of a novel. It started in 1950. Jacqueline Bouvier was still a young woman then, years away from the White House, when she traveled to Ireland. She met Father Leonard during that trip to Dublin in 1950, and an unlikely friendship took root. The gap between them was striking. She was 21 years old. He was 73. The connection came through family. Leonard had known Jackie's step-uncle since the 1920s, and it was he who suggested the two should meet when she visited Ireland. What might have been a single polite introduction became something that lasted the rest of the priest's life. In person, they only ever met once more in 1955. Everything else passed through the mail, and the correspondence stretched from 1950 until Leonard's death in 1964. Think about that for a moment. A friendship sustained almost entirely through ink and paper, across an ocean, between a glamorous young American and an elderly Irish priest. He was, in many ways, the safest person in her world. He wanted nothing from her. He could not gossip to the press or trade on her name. He was simply a kind ear far away, and she trusted him with the things she could not say out loud. And the things she said in those early years show a side of Jackie the public never saw. Before she was a Kennedy, before she was First Lady, she was a sharp and observant young woman finding her own way. In the letters, she shared her excitement about her first job in journalism at the Washington Times-Herald. She was curious, ambitious, and far more candid than her later public image would ever suggest. But the most striking of these early letters had to do with the man she was falling for, a rising young politician named John F. Kennedy. In a letter written in July 1952, long before the wedding, Jackie wrote about him with a clarity that is almost unsettling in hindsight. She compared Kennedy, then a congressman from Massachusetts, to Shakespeare's Macbeth, drawn to ambition, and she worried openly that he would not be faithful to her. She even compared him to her own father, a charming man who, in her words, loved the chase and grew restless once he had won. These were not the thoughts of a starry-eyed girl. They were the private fears of a woman who saw clearly what she was walking into, and chose to walk into it anyway. That honesty is the thread that runs through everything she wrote to Father Leonard. She did not perform for him, she confessed. As the years passed and the marriage became real, the letters matured along with her. The early excitement gave way to deeper reflection. Looking back on how quickly she and Kennedy had married, she admitted that she was almost ashamed at how fast and lightly they had rushed into it. But she came to believe that the suffering that followed had been the best thing for them both, the kind of shock that forces two people to grow up. This is the part of the letters that historians found so valuable. They were not a single snapshot. They were a record of change, of a young woman slowly becoming the composed figure the world would later admire, written down in real time as it happened. The public only ever met the finished portrait. These pages showed the brushstrokes. And then, as her life moved toward its most public chapter, the letters carried her into the White House and the unimaginable pressure that came with it. By the early 1960s, Jackie was First Lady of the United States, watched and photographed and copied around the globe. Her image was everything: the elegance, the calm, the famous mystique. Part of her fame rested on exactly that mystery, the sense that no one quite knew the real Jackie Kennedy. But Father Leonard knew, or at least he knew more than almost anyone. While the world saw the perfect First Lady, she was still mailing him her private worries, her faith, her doubts, the ordinary fears of a woman carrying an extraordinary weight. It is one of the great quiet ironies of her life. The more famous she became, the more she needed a place to be unguarded. And that place was a letter to an old priest in Dublin who would never tell a soul. But the correspondence was not only about ambition and marriage and fame. It also carried her through real grief, and this is where the letters turn from interesting to heartbreaking. Jackie knew loss long before the moment the world remembers. In her letters, she mourned the death of her son. Her infant boy, Patrick, lived only a few days in the summer of 1963. For a mother already familiar with sorrow, it was a devastating blow, and she turned, as she so often did, to the page and to the priest who had become her confidant. Her faith was tested again and again, and she did not hide that testing from him. She wrote about God honestly, sometimes gratefully, sometimes with anger, never with the careful neutrality of a public figure. That honesty would reach its peak just a few months later, after the single event that would define how the world remembered her forever. On the 22nd of November 1963, in Dallas, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated as his wife sat beside him. The world saw her courage in the days that followed, the dignity of the funeral, the steady hand that guided a grieving nation through its ceremony. What the world did not see was what she wrote afterward in private to Father Leonard. In those letters, her composure fell away. She wrote that she had become bitter against God. She questioned whether there was a God at all, and if there was, why he would take her young husband from her. She wondered aloud whether God had taken Jack to show the world how lost it would be without him, and then admitted that even to her this was a strange way to think. She wrestled, openly and painfully, with whether she could still believe in anything at all. In the end, she held on to faith for a single reason. She felt she had to believe there was a God, or she would have no hope of ever finding Jack again. There is something almost unbearably human in that. The most admired widow in the world, the image of strength on every front page, privately telling a priest that her faith was hanging by a thread, and that the only thing keeping it alive was the hope of seeing her husband once more. And even in that darkest moment, her thoughts turned to her children. She wrote that she did not want to raise them in a bitter way. Whatever she was feeling, she was determined that her grief would not poison the two young children who still needed her. That single line tells you everything about who she really was, not the icon, the mother. The correspondence ended the following year in 1964, when Father Leonard died. The man who had carried her secrets for 14 years was gone, and with him went the safest place she had ever had to set down her heart. After that, Jackie's life moved on into new chapters that the public watched closely. She would later remarry, becoming the wife of the Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis, and she would guard her privacy fiercely until her own death in 1994. But the letters remained, sleeping in that Dublin safe, waiting. When they finally surfaced in 2014, they did not bring a clean ending. They brought a controversy. The letters had been held at All Hallows College in Dublin, a Catholic institution run by the Vincentian Fathers, where Leonard had lived. When the college fell into financial trouble and was put up for sale, it sought to raise money by selling the letters, with hopes the collection could fetch a vast sum. Almost immediately, people objected. There was sharp criticism that the college was selling deeply personal letters that had never been meant for public eyes, and the Kennedy family raised concerns. The objection touched something real. These were not state papers or political documents. They were a grieving woman's most private confessions, written to a friend in confidence. To put them on an auction block felt, to many, like a violation of the very trust that had made them so honest in the first place. In the end, the sale was stopped. The letters were pulled from the June auction, the auction house returned the archive, and the Vincentian Fathers asserted ownership before transferring the correspondence to the Kennedy family. The decision, the order said, was made out of respect for what was, after all, correspondence of a private nature. The window into Jackie's heart that had opened so suddenly was, just as suddenly, gently closed again. And perhaps that is the most fitting end to the story. The woman who spent her life protecting her privacy had it protected for her one last time, even decades after her death. So what do these letters finally reveal? Not scandal, not a hidden secret that changes history, something quieter and more lasting. They reveal the distance between the image and the person. The world had built a statue of Jacqueline Kennedy, perfect and unreadable, and these pages reminded everyone that underneath it was a real woman who feared betrayal, who doubted her faith, who buried a child, who lost her husband in the most public way imaginable, and who still, through all of it, refused to let bitterness reach her children. She had been honest with one old priest because she believed no one else would ever read it, and in being honest, she left behind something no official portrait ever could. Proof that the most composed woman of her age was, in private, as frightened and faithful and human as anyone. The icon belonged to the world. The letters belonged to her. And for a brief moment in 2014, before they were quietly returned, the world got to meet the woman the icon had been hiding all along. What do you think these private letters reveal about the real Jacqueline Kennedy? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.